The reason why I want to do this work, I've read it somewhere in high school, the Guano War, and I always thought it's sort of one of those things that's just stuck in your head. It's like, how ridiculous is that nation went to war over excrement. so, and so it's sort of kind of stuck in my head, and then recently, what's happening in the South China Sea, with China extremely aggressive in trying to they actually took over many of these islands and claiming the whole South China Sea as part of their territory. And territory, fishing right, the shipping lanes, as well as the natural resources there. There's something like 10 billion barrels, potential 10 billion barrels of oil down there. And so all of this kind of come into play, but it brought me back to this story about the Guano War, as well as the American overseas expansion. Because of the Guano War, the guano, the Americans want to access it, and they use that as an excuse to expand beyond the continent. And I think in the exhibition you see that that was the first time the American expand beyond into the sea, in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and they claim over 100 islands as part of their territory. And so all of this was quite interesting for me. And then so when James Lingwood of Art Angel and Jonathan Watkins of Icon Gallery asked me what I'm interested in doing, actually I proposed two. One was to go and locate north of Saigon the helicopter that crashed into the sea, and the last two American soldiers died in the Vietnam War were inside those helicopters. They never able to.
So you were going to go and find it.
We're going to find it and bring the helicopter up. And also, I was interested in filming the graveyard of these helicopters under the sea, but it would be too expensive, costly, and not only that, but politically, it was quite sensitive for the Vietnamese government. I don't think it's possible. So we're like, okay, we'll put that on hold, maybe 10 years from now. So we decided to go with this. And also, I think the idea was for me to, I was also interested in kind of making some work that beyond the Vietnam War, because my focus the last 20 years have been kind of looking at the Vietnam War from different perspectives and bringing different stories out. So we decided to kind of do this project.
So I mean, I think if you've all had a chance to see the work, so you can see it's set on these islands off Peru, where nothing grows and it never rains, and that's a great place for this bird excrement to build up, and then that was a fertilizer that became very it was discovered to be very potent in the 1840s, so suddenly became very valuable. And Dinh was talking about this map that is on the floor on one of the screens in there, where you can see which islands America claimed. So that's sort of America's first foray into empire building in this act of the Guano Act, where it could lay claim to any of these islands. But while it was sort of busy doing all that legal stuff, the Spanish and the British just kind of came in and just started actually mining stuff, and having had the experience already of having empire and exploiting empire for a good 200, 300 years already, they kind of were able to go into full exploitation mode and bring all that back, and get very rich from doing that.
The Spaniards actually didn't were not successful as the British.
Yeah.
Because the Spaniards were the colonizer of Peru and many of the South American countries. So, but so of course the Peru didn't trust them very much. So, but what they tried to do was to come back to have some influence in the region, and they sent ships to attack and took over Chincha Island, which is where the largest deposit of guano. We're talking about these 3 islands, one next to another, pretty much, and when they first start harvesting it, the amount of guano is 90 meters tall. So we're talking about a mountain here. Yeah, that's how crazy it was. Yeah. So, but eventually other nations I think it was Chile, joined the fight with the Spaniard, against the Spaniard. And they won, and finally Queen Isabella gave up altogether on any desire to come back to the new South America again. So that pretty much kind of put an end to the empire of Spain in the New World.
You were saying that these are sort of 90-meter mountains. So we have these pictures we dug up from the 1850s, 60s, where you can see this mountain, and it's all gone now. They're all flat. Yeah. I mean, they have these cliffs.
Yeah, now it just gone. I mean, now every time they harvest it, they clean it down to the rock bottom. Yeah. Basically, every 10 years, the deposit would come to about this high, and then they come in and they pretty much by hand. It's exactly the same way they harvested when in the 1800s to today. They just basically by hand, axe and all that, and brush. By the time they get to the rocks, they brush it clean. So conceptually, it's quite interesting because they literally clean the island by brush. Yeah.
But also that when they were initially doing this in the 19th century, that they were using these indentured Chinese laborers.
Yeah.
So coming over, it's like extremely exploitative. You were saying like 30% of them died on the way?
At the height of it, many of the, and this is actually so there's 2 group of people that make a lot of money out of the guano trade. So there's the merchants who primarily monopolized by the England, and then you have the other group, which is made up of many nations, of the indentured servant trade. So to bring the Chinese over to South America to work.
Why Chinese?
At that time in Peru banned slavery. So, and then also England, I think, also banned slavery. So trading company can no longer use slave to harvest this thing, this guano anymore. So they searched around at that time. China was quite poor and famine was taking place, and so there was a surplus of laborers in China, and so the emperor there allowed the traders to come in and basically sign contract with his laborers to come work for, but I think about 7 years, and then you're free. But in the 7 years, basically you're a slave.
And it's a sort of that it has some really unpleasant parallels with what's going on now, because there's people migrating in search of a better life, and they had this very sad irony that a lot of those laborers thought they were going to the gold rush in California, but actually they were going to the shit rush in Ginger Island. So
yeah, I mean, it was pretty horrible for these people, and many people compare it to the slave trade in the Atlantic. The amount of people died along this because of the condition in the ship and all that. So we're looking about 30%. At the high of it, 30% of the ship would die, the number would die. And then once they get onto this island, now you have to understand this island are completely barren. And
it never rains.
Never rains, and then the working condition now is a little bit better, but I think you saw it. It's not much better, and then many of them also were homesick, and so many of them also committed suicide. One of the story I heard is that they would jump off the cliff and thinking that the current would carry their body home to China. And so that was a kind of pretty crazy period. I think that's something that for me was kind of interesting because right now, at that time, the Chinese participant in this event, they were the victim. And then the American, of course, the aggressor who take up all these islands. And but today it's the reverse in a way. The Chinese in South China Sea, they sort of take over this kind of 19th century attitude of just like whatever, you take whatever you can. Yeah. And the American now is, of course, trying to be the good cop, but of course they have their own ulterior motives as well. So,
and that's something, because in this installation, the main large projections is across 3 screens. So you have these images of these birds flying, filmed by this drone. So they capture, the birds from above. You have that bird's eye view, and then coming over onto the people, and they sort of, because they look like ants or something, they too look like a group of animals kind of behaving in this very regimented way. And so you actually have that American presence in a way that it's looking from above from this technology that they've developed. And there's a sort of very ominous sense of what might be to come with that.
Yeah, I think the drone is really kind of a strange thing now. With everything is kind of, I think we have developed it now as a deadly weapon now. But we also, I think a lot of people are trying to use the drone, develop it in a more positive way as well. Yeah. And so I was thinking of the drone coming in this way as this kind of very futuristic as well, to come in and kind of try to scan or explore these ruins as a kind of something from the future, looking at this. But at the same time, the future is here and it's now. It's not like the 22nd century but it feels like that, and I want that kind of feeling, the future, the past, and the present all kind of collapse in this work by using the drone.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at, the people who are currently mining there as being the present, mining, but that in the future, or as you say, the present future, like the drone is used to kind of mine us in a way that it's surveilling us, it's watching us, and that's something that people have this sense that technology in a way is mining out, that your computer knows what you're looking at, and it's taking that information from you. So it's again this, where's the control lying? And you do, at the end of the film, you and your crew become visible, and you take back control of the drone, which I think is an optimistic gesture.
Yeah, it is, because also it's a reminder that this technology, we control these technologies.
For now.
For now. So. How are we doing?
For time, we could.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe we could just say some bit more about these, because one thing here is the animation of the labourers from the past, because you're saying this is the first work where you've not actually been able to interview
Yeah, because the other works use a kind of structure of a documentary in order to kind of tell the story, or rather, I want to use the platform to give the people to able to talk directly to tell directly about their story rather than through some other somebody else interpret it for them. But this work is sort of impossible. Most of the people that were there are no longer with us. The workers, I cannot access to them because the government in Peru would not allow us to have to talk to them, to film their living quarters. Not the abandoned one that you saw, but the tent cities that were set up for these people on the island that we filmed when they were harvesting. So it was impossible to have that. So we decided to change the format of the film and to be kind of more abstract and more poetic in a way, and then to have this animation or flat screen on the floor kind of interject snippet of informations, different event that connecting to this guano history.
And it's like the traces of that are, the animated sort of pencil traces, but also that those traces, there's this sort of horrible thing where the Chinese laborers were buried in these very shallow graves. So now, as they're saying that they brush the island clean each time that the Chinese laborers' bodies kind of come up when they're harvesting.
Yeah, there's on Chincha Island, which is the main island, where there's a graveyard. People know sort of where it is in that area, but because the bird guano over the years just pile up, so nobody know exactly where the graves are, but they just know in general. So yeah, I think every 10 years they come back and they harvest it. I'm sure they dig up a lot of remains from the mid 1800s. Yeah.
But also having this abstract sense that it's a sort of more sinister way that because you weren't allowed to film directly, like the one thing that you can see from the structures that you can film is that like the hospital dominates. Mm-hmm. So you know like why do you have to have this huge hospital? Because there are these people farming ammonia rich all day, with no protection, and that obviously will have horrible consequences for them. So you can sort of the exploitation that it has been the history of that island is written into it.
Yeah, no, I mean you can feel it when you're on the island, and you can feel the kind of dark, heavy, particularly at the infirmary, because we sort of put it off filming that place until the end. Because there's something about that place that we didn't like and we didn't want to go in. And that's actually the last day of the filming, and we crashed one of our drone. And we were like, oh, we should have filmed that place. But the presence of something is there.
Yeah.
I don't believe in it, but you can feel it. It's quite amazing. So there's I think nothing is erased there. Nothing is washed off there. Everything is written onto the land, the soil there, because there's no rain, so nothing drains off, and also because it's so isolated, somehow nothing our contemporary world don't touch it.
Yeah.
It's sort of kind of in a kind of time. It's capsule.
Yeah.
It remains in itself because it's so far away from land. On a good boat, it took us 3 hours to get there. Yeah. So.
But on the other hand, like its influence, it's the time when the guano became discovered as this very valuable commodity was the time where, coinciding with industrialization and this easier movement of things around the globe, it's one of the earliest kind of globalized commodities. Yeah. And we were talking earlier about there's been some research done which is, not necessarily proven, but a theory about how the guano was used to fertilize the potatoes in Peru, and then those potatoes were exported around the world, and they brought with them the potato blight, which had such massive consequences here. So it's interesting that even though it's these very isolated islands, like the effect spills out here.
Yeah. No, I mean,
everywhere around the world.
In my research, there's so many offshoots that you can keep going. This is, during the reason why the guano becomes so important is because this was before chemical fertilizer. So, and then the New World and the Old World, they didn't know that they're supposed to rotate their crops. So they're planting the same thing over and over again, and it completely drained the soil of any nutrient for whatever they grow. So guano was the only thing. So that's why so many nations were interested in this, and it changed the face of the Pacific. Before everything, all the trades and all this thing happened were in the Atlantic, all the trade between the New World and the Old World. And then when this happened, the Pacific sort of opened up as a potential new place for exploitation, basically. Yeah. And then, so many nations start to focus on the Atlantic. And that was the kind of, and then it led to so many other kind of, many other nations also did what the American did. Also, they tried to grab many islands as possible that have guano, and it's many of them actually in near Africa area, and all that. So it's quite interesting how such a lowly material can have such a big impact around the world.
And it's really fascinating now to draw with having the drone, which represents this ability to now see over the whole world, to go to places which, are possibly inaccessible to humans, but this drone can have that oversight, and that this was the sort of first commodity where that similarly, like, it's spread out across the world, and then in the same way now the drone can come. I was interested in satellite images actually of this island, but it would become too costly also. And I don't know how to access those either. We buy you an underwater thing for your helicopter project and a satellite.
I was interested in this but then I thought, okay, maybe we can do with the drone. But the drone, I've seen a lot of drones work where the drone is never present. It's sort of, but with this work, I also wanted to be the actors in the film as well, become an active kind of part and not this kind of, they're there, we know they're there, but they're never part of the, so that was the why it's just not hovering, but it's actually become actors.
Like with the dragonflies and the helicopter, they become like something which a human, it does have control over it, but it also kind of, it's mysterious in some way.
Yeah, because even the helicopter, there's a human in control it. But in the film, I think many of, for those of you have seen, the people in the film talk about it as an animal. They wasn't thinking of this is a machine, this is a machine with a person inside, but they talk about that as an animal. And that's for me, that was really kind of interesting. And I think in many ways we sort of in a kind of denial mode of saying, okay, this machine do horrible thing, they're just machine, they're some entity that's not human in a way. So I think in part that's why in the end I want to show that we are the people that control, that controlling it, and not, you can't kind of say that this is just a machine who did all the dirty work.
Yeah. Can't pass well, it comes back to the thing we've been talking about, like the responsibility and like whose narrative, who's going to control that narrative.
We were in Peru for a month, and we filmed 3, 4. We will film in 4 islands, but in 4 separate parts of Peru. The harvesting you saw, we filmed in 2 islands, Guanyape North and Guanyape South, which is about 2 hours from the coast, and we spent 3 nights there on those islands. We couldn't spend on the island where the worker were, so we spent the night on the island right next to it, and then every morning at around 5 we have to go on the island, because actually they start working at 4 in the morning because it's cooler. And they work, and it's so physical demanding that they stop at midday, at noon, and because also it gets really hot. But they couldn't work until the afternoon, because it's so physical demanding that they couldn't work the following day if they work the 8 hours that we usually work. So so they work, and they're not paid by the days or by the hour, but they're paying by the load that they've been harvesting. So how much they harvest, then they get paid by that.
Yeah, you see that when they have it on their back and they kind of, it's pushing them down the hill.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's 50 kilos bags. So pound, it's like 100 pounds bag. And they use the gravity of the landscape to pull them, and so they run, so it's easier to run and then just dump it over. And so if they do that all 8 hours a day, there's no way they could come back the following day.
Can I ask about the music? What brief did you give to the composer?
The composer is a composer from LA, and basically we want one of the things that I told him was that when I visited it, I felt this was, I related to, the first thing that came to my mind was Kafka, the penal colony, where, and a kind of absurdity that in this day and age, this kind of hand-on kind of labor still exists, and the condition, it was just, and these people cannot leave the island every day. They live there, and they only leave once a month to go see their family, and then they have to come back. And usually they work for a 6 months period, and then the harvest ends, and then it becomes too hot. So they wait another 6 months, then the harvest on a different island. So so basically, I asked him that this to kind of look at Kafka, the penal colonies story, and then kind of think about that. Yeah, but he's really an amazing composer. We were very happy that he agreed to work with us.
I was struck by the first installation with the beauty of the landscape, and the birds are taken off, and it's amazing.
Okay.
And so abstract. Did you have that in mind before you went, or was that just something you found when you was actually filming?
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful there, even though all the smell and being shit on all the time. It was just unbelievably beautiful. I mean, it's one of the places that I will never forget in my life. When we have our downtime and not filming anything, we're just like constantly amazed that we're on this island. And so I want the audience to appreciate that, how beautiful it is. And yet this beautiful landscape contains such horror that took place there. There's such history, and how this history also affects the rest of the world.
It seemed like another world. It's like as if you land on Mars. And I was saying to my friend that you would envy the birds if you worked on there, because the birds could fly away.
Yeah.
But also that the birds made it. So like the birds, they made it, and it's where they are, and then the humans come and disturb that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, you know, this is the El Nino year, and so many of them will die this year because the current there, what's happening is the current there, it's really cold from the south coming up, and so as a result, the anchovy follow this current. And then with this year, the El Nino, it will drive the current south. And as a result, the water get warmer and the anchovy sort of left the area. And so many of them this year will die. And so there won't be as many birds. And so it was, in a way, it was quite urgent that we shoot it this year. And then it will take time for it to rebuild its population again. So yeah, there's a lot of drama there that we don't think about. There's a lot of, and so thinking about that, many of them will die of starvation. But right now they have, maybe not right now, but they have very cushy life also. What we're joking about is they're like the Vietnamese. We wake up, we have our breakfast, we have our coffee, and then maybe we'll go to work at 10 o'clock. And that's exactly what the bird did. And they woke up, they stand around, they chatter with each other, and then pretty much at 10 o'clock, the whole thing fly off. And then at 2 o'clock, they come back. That's it, that's their day. They have their food, and then they stand around the cliff and they chatter and then go to bed. And then we started. It's pretty kind of amazing life in a way.
Did drones make them fly off in that first?
In the beginning,
Yeah.
they will fly off, but then a little while, they're just sort of, they don't know what it is also. They never have a natural predator, like a big bird or anything. So the only predator they have are human. And so this thing flying, at first they were scared, but then it didn't affect them, so they just sort of avoid it. But many times we thought they're just going to crash into it, but it didn't. So, but yeah, at some point the drone were completely surrounded by them.
You told me earlier that they still harvest this to be used as like a green fertilizer.
Yeah, because in the last 10-15 years, the green movement is is really powerful now.
Do you feel it? Would you use it, knowing everything you know about where it's come from and its history? Would you be happy using it?
There's on one hand, you don't want all this chemical, and then on the other hand, the labor abuse. Maybe not abuse, but it's quite difficult working conditions for those people.
Then there's this added layer isn't there, with the like the fishing. So it's actually like, while there's a small resurgence in the interest in guano, it's a Peruvian state-controlled industry,
Yeah.
which they use just to fertilize their own Peruvian crops. And actually it's much more valuable to them to fish for all the fish, and then that fish gets turned into fish meal, which gets exported, and that's how they feed livestock in America. So that's a more valuable...
Well, they tried that actually
Yeah.
in the 70s. Before the green fertilizer movement, the guano was pretty much not export internationally because it's too expensive to export it. By the time we get to the American market, it would be too expensive for people. And so in the 70s, guano was not a big revenues for the Peruvian government anymore. And so they thought they were going to developing the fishing industry and harvest the anchovies, because in those cold water have a lot of anchovies in there, and do the fish meal. And what they found is that they almost decimated the bird population there.
Yeah, so it's like that before the human intervention, there was the...
So there's this connection that you can't really make that kind of which one is better.
Yeah.
You know, it's like everything. And so after that, after the failure, the anchovy exporting as food for animals, the government actually realized the chain effect that it has. And so now it's one of the best conservation program in the world in terms of protecting these birds.
Yeah.
And so I think, so maybe now I can say that, yes, I prefer the fertilizer, the guano, than the chemical fertilizer, even though it comes with, but I think, you know, in terms of, I don't know about the green fertilizer. There's a kind of fair trade movement in terms of some, you know, maybe pay these workers more for their very tough work in order for us to have. But they are expensive compared to other fertilizer.
Like the chemical.
Yeah.
But this is when you're saying about this, like having the fish or having the, you know, that worked for a little bit and then that stopped working because the birds were going to go away, and then the guano worked at first. The oldest guano deposits were like the best ones because they'd been sort of had the most nutrients, and then that all got mined away. So now it's not like quite as good quality as when it was first.
I'm not quite sure. You know, fresh. It's fresh.
But that like we don't kind of understand the full consequences of what we do at the time when we do it, and then only after so many decades it plays out. Actually, this has very far-reaching consequences. So again, I think with the drone, you know, we know a bit about what the potential of that is, and like you're saying now, this is the Middle East. That's where that war. But I guess in 50, 100 years' time, we'll have a different perspective now, and it'll maybe be more or less ominous than it already is.
Maybe we develop new technology, and then the drones seem to be very quaint like the helicopter now.
Phoebe, would you mind kind of speaking just a wee bit about Archangel, because of course like this work would never have been commissioned without Archangel, and I know that they commission really exciting, challenging, unusual, big work. Could you speak a bit about how Archangel came into Dinh's life and how the work was made?
So, like you said, so James is the director of Archangel, James Lingwood, and he saw your piece in Documenta, which is the middle one that we showed you, The Light and Belief, and then got to talking to you and said, what do you want to do? And we're quite lucky because we don't have a building, so we can, you know, meet with an artist like Dinh and say, what do you want to do? And Dinh can say, oh, I have this idea for a 20-year project that I want to develop. And so in some ways we have a freedom to, you know, give you a bit of more time than you might. We don't have a set slot that we need something to be delivered for. And also it's just about, you know, working alongside, you know, our organisation, working with Dinh, saying, you know, what is it that you want to do, and allowing you to be as ambitious as possible within some constraints. Like, we don't have any satellites that we currently can use, but, you know, that we can hopefully allow you some.
No, I mean, it's an amazing kind of freedom.
Thank you so much to Dinh and Phoebe. It's really fantastic to see kind of what goes on behind, you know, the exhibition, the making of the work, the funding of the work, the challenges that the work presents. And, you know, again, this wouldn't have happened without Art Angel.